We are now in the first part of this story. It is the early 1960s, and the American South simmers with tension so thick it seems to cling to the air itself. The summer heat weighs heavily on every street corner, pressing down on people's shoulders as they go about their daily routines. In this place, separate drinking fountains, back entrances to theaters, and forbidden seats on buses are not strange exceptions. They have become a grotesque kind of normal. Neighbors share the same sky and breathe the same humid air, yet many seem convinced that an invisible line divides them. On one side of that line stand those who believe they were born to hold power. On the other side are those who must fight for every scrap of dignity and opportunity. It is a world shaped by an iron grip of custom and prejudice, where even the oldest oak trees seem to have witnessed too much silence and suffering. In a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of a small southern city, Marcus grows up watching it all, his eyes both curious and cautious. He is a lean young African-American man with serious eyes and a gentle voice that he rarely raises above a quiet confidence. He lives with his family in a weathered home set close to a dusty road. There are no lush gardens or grand porches here, just simple yards with clotheslines and makeshift fences. At sunrise, the neighborhood hums softly with the sounds of people preparing for their day's work, mothers pressing uniforms, fathers lacing worn shoes, children brushing the last traces of sleep from their eyes. These families know how to survive on very little, how to endure without complaint, yet they also carry dreams stubborn enough to withstand the weight of centuries. Marcus's parents are people of quiet strength. His father works long hours doing manual labor for a factory that barely notices his existence. His mother finds ways to stretch every dollar until it almost tears. From them, Marcus learns that endurance can be a form of defiance. He watches them meet life's unfairness with calm determination, refusing to let bitterness poison their hearts. They speak to him often about respect and pride, about how he must never bow his head too low, even when the world tries to convince him he is less than others. They tell him he can be anything, though they know the world might not give him many chances. In church on Sundays, Marcus sits in a wooden pew beside his parents and siblings, listening to the pastor's voice rise and fall like a weary but unbroken hymn. Neighbors dressed in their best clothes shared looks and nods that say, without words, that they are all in this struggle together. Here, Marcus picks up another lesson, that faith and community can help people stand taller, even when the laws and customs around them try to keep them on their knees. Marcus is different in a subtle way that even he cannot fully explain yet. While some people around him let anger or despair shape their responses, Marcus turns inward. As a boy, he prefers to observe closely rather than jump into arguments. He watches how the local shopkeeper speaks respectfully to one customer and with cold dismissal to another. He notices how, at the schoolhouse, the books for black children are older and tattered compared to the ones for white children. He feels a simmering question forming inside him: who decided these rules, and why must everyone follow them? In the kitchen of his home, late in the evening when the house is quiet, Marcus sits with a worn paperback he borrowed from a friend. The pages smelled like old paper and dust, and the words transport him into worlds he has never seen. He learns about people who challenged unfair laws, who dared to think that justice might belong to everyone. He does not fully understand yet how to bring such ideas into his own life, but he feels something take root inside his chest, a longing that grows stronger with every page he turns. He might be just a teenager still discovering himself, but he knows he wants something better than the narrow fate others have planned for him. Outside the window, the world is restless. Protests have begun to stir in nearby towns. Whispers travel on the wind about people marching, sitting at lunch counters, risking their jobs and their safety to question the ancient codes of segregation. Marcus listens to these stories and feels a pull inside his heart. He cannot fully name it. Maybe it's hope, maybe it's courage, but it makes his hands tremble slightly when he thinks about the future. He imagines using words and logic, the power of reason and law, to tear down the crooked systems that have held his community in place for too long. It's a wild, audacious dream, especially for a young black man in the Deep South, but dreams don't need anyone's permission to exist. Tonight, as Marcus settles into bed, he stares at the ceiling. The chorus of crickets outside hums softly, and the distant laughter of neighbors drifts in through the thin walls. He knows his life is not separate from the times he's living in. He understands that every choice he makes, from how he carries himself on the street to how he studies and prepares for the future, is a quiet act of resistance. There is fear, yes, but also a promise that he will not go down without trying to bend the arc of the world just a bit closer to justice. His mind is set on becoming a lawyer. It may be a path filled with obstacles he can barely imagine, but he already senses that it is the route he must take. He wakes before dawn, sliding quietly out of bed so as not to disturb his younger siblings. The small home creaks with every step, and the scent of cornbread his mother baked the evening before still lingers faintly in the air. Marcus splashes cold water on his face, trying to shake off the last traces of sleep. He has school today, a place where he's expected to learn, but is so often reminded of his supposed place in the world. Still, he's determined. There's too much at stake to let anyone's expectations define his worth. Walking through dusty streets toward the segregated high school designated for black students, Marcus can already hear the distant hum of the buses carrying white children to their newer, better resourced classrooms. He won't ever step foot in those facilities. That's just how it is, everyone says. The textbooks waiting for him are years out of date, their pages dog-eared and ink-faded, names scrawled in margins by countless other students who came and went, hoping for something more. There aren't enough desks for everyone some days, and the heating rarely works in winter. But Marcus brings with him a quiet resolve. These difficulties will not break him. He wants a life beyond the narrow script set out for him, and he knows that education is his key, even if it's given grudgingly. Inside the classroom, sunlight tries to peek through grimy windows. The teacher, Mrs. Coleman, is a strict but caring woman who does her best with what she has. She often lingers after class, offering extra help to students who show promise. Marcus is one of her favorites, though she tries not to show it too openly. After all, it wouldn't do to raise expectations too high, not when the world outside is so eager to crush them. Yet, she sees something in him, a thoughtful spirit, a hunger to understand not just the facts and figures in the book, but the reasons behind them. Once, she slipped him a pamphlet about a civil rights lawyer who argued cases that challenged segregation. She said quietly, "Marcus, I believe you could do something like this one day." That small gesture, that tiny spark of faith, was more encouragement than he'd received from anyone outside his family. In the afternoons, after he finishes chores at home, Marcus sometimes ventures to a small library a few blocks away. It isn't grand, just a converted room in a community center, but it's quiet, and it has books he can borrow. He reads about heroes who fought injustice, philosophers who questioned the moral codes of their societies, and political thinkers who insisted that everyone deserved the protection of the law. The more he reads, the more the idea of becoming a lawyer takes shape in his mind. He doesn't just want to make a decent living or escape his current conditions. He wants to challenge the rules that keep his community stuck in place. He remembers a particular incident that first stirred this dream. He was no more than 10 at the time, walking with his father to the local store. They were told to wait outside while a white customer who arrived later was served first. Marcus watched his father's jaw tighten, saw the disappointment in his eyes. His father didn't argue. He knew better than to risk a confrontation that could lead to violence, but the humiliation hovered in the air. Marcus thought then, why do we have to accept this? Why can't we have a voice that forces them to respect us? As he grows older, Marcus notices that not all his friends share his drive. Some have already accepted the world as it is. They mutter that trying to change things will only bring trouble. They talk of taking whatever work they can get, keeping their heads down, and surviving. Marcus understands their fears. He feels them too. But he can't shake this inner voice that says he must try. He must fight back in a way that doesn't invite fists or bullets, but demands justice through words and reason. The difficulties he faces are not just about race, but also about money. His family doesn't have much, and college seems like a distant planet, unattainable and far away. Law school might as well be on the moon. But he's heard rumors of scholarships, aid programs, small cracks in the fortress of segregation that might let a determined young man slip through. He asks Mrs. Coleman about these possibilities, and she nods, encouraging him to aim high. She promises to help him find a way, even if it means writing letters to organizations up north, pleading his case. One day, as he's walking home, Marcus stops by a local community center where a small group of neighbors has gathered to discuss ways to improve their lot. A local reverend with kind but serious eyes speaks passionately about the need for more young voices in the movement. He says the law can be a tool of oppression or a tool of liberation, depending on who wields it. Marcus listens, heart pounding. Every word feels directed at him. It's as if the universe keeps leaving breadcrumbs, urging him along the path he's chosen. That night, he confides in his father about his dream of becoming a lawyer. His father looks at him for a long moment. He is proud but also worried. He knows the risks that come with standing out, especially as a black man challenging the status quo. But he also loves his son and wants him to live fully, not chained by fear. "If that's what you want, son," he says quietly, "we'll find a way." It's the closest thing to an open endorsement Marcus has heard from him, and it buoys his spirit. His mother, too, offers support in her gentle, unspoken way. She starts setting aside a little money each week, even though they have so little to spare. She doesn't mention it, but Marcus notices smaller portions at dinner for herself, and he understands. This sacrifice plants in him a deep gratitude and a promise he won't waste this chance if it comes. As the school year progresses, Marcus pushes himself harder. He studies late into the night, borrows any book he can find. He begins to see himself as part of something bigger. Maybe one day he could help remove those old, tattered signs that say whites only. Maybe he could stand in front of a judge and argue that his people deserve equality before the law. He's still young and uncertain, but his aspirations have solidified. He wants to become a lawyer, to break down barriers that have stood for far too long. In these early years, as he battles outdated textbooks and peers who call him a fool for dreaming too big, Marcus learns an essential truth: that dreams are not fantasies if one dares to reach out and shape them into reality. He is determined to do just that. He awakens one morning to a silence that feels heavier than usual. Outside, the cicadas should be chirping, but it's as if the whole neighborhood is holding its breath. Marcus steps onto the porch, blinking in the early light. Across the street, Mr. Daniels, the kindly man who runs a small corner store, stands stiff and quiet, arms crossed over his chest. A group of white men in neat uniforms have parked their car in front of the store's entrance. Marcus can't hear their words, but he sees the sneer on one man's face, the way he points at a sign on the door that reads "All Welcome." Mr. Daniels, who has been trying to integrate his customers, allowing anyone to enter through the front door, now faces these men as though he's cornered in his own home. The tension hums in the sticky morning air. Marcus feels something in his chest tighten. He wants to run over, to demand explanations, to shout that Mr. Daniels is doing nothing wrong. But fear and caution hold him back. He's still a teenager, still uncertain of his power. Instead, he steps down from the porch and edges closer along the dusty road. He can make out snippets of conversation now. The men accuse Mr. Daniels of stirring trouble, of not knowing his place. One of them hisses something about reporting him to the authorities, maybe even revoking his license to operate. Mr. Daniels stands tall, though Marcus can see the tremor in his hands. They eventually drive off, leaving behind a silence that rings in Marcus's ears. He crosses the street. Mr. Daniels offers a tight smile, pretending that nothing is amiss. But his eyes, usually warm and welcoming, are clouded with hurt. Marcus feels anger, shame, and a surge of protectiveness all at once. How many times will he witness moments like these, small acts of cruelty disguised as law and order? How many lives will be twisted by these unspoken rules that say a man like Mr. Daniels can't run his store the way he sees fit, simply because of the color of his customer's skin? That afternoon, Marcus can't shake the image of Mr. Daniels' trembling hands. It gnaws at him, whispering that if he doesn't act, these injustices will never end. He recalls all he's read about lawyers who challenged segregation, who stood in courtrooms and demanded that dignity not be rationed by race. Something in him crystallizes. He's always wanted to be a lawyer, but now it's no longer an idea floating in his mind. Now it's a calling, sharpened into a blade of purpose. He imagines himself facing those uniformed men, not with fists raised or voice shouting, but with knowledge and authority on his side. He imagines using the law, that very weapon so often wielded against his people, to shield them instead. He shares this new determination with his parents at the kitchen table later that evening. His father nods thoughtfully, his mother rests her hand gently on Marcus's arm, and there's a mutual understanding in their silence. They know the path he's choosing is dangerous. People who stand against the status quo become targets. Yet, they also know their son is not one to be dissuaded by fear. He will find a way, just as their ancestors found ways to survive hardships unthinkable in another era. They give him their blessing, as much as any parents can when sending a child into a future fraught with risks. News of Marcus's growing ambition trickles through the community. The local reverend, who organizes meetings at the church after Sunday service, pulls Marcus aside one afternoon. He tells Marcus that education and legal expertise are vital tools in the struggle for equality. He offers to introduce Marcus to a neighbor who once worked as a legal clerk up north. The Reverend explains that this man, Mr. Richardson, may offer guidance, possibly help Marcus find resources to prepare for college admissions. Marcus's heart lifts at the thought of connecting with someone who understands the legal world, someone who can help him trace a path from these dusty streets to a law school's polished halls. A few days later, Marcus meets Mr. Richardson in a quiet corner of the church's back room. The man is middle-aged, with calm eyes that hint at stories he's not eager to tell but won't hesitate to share if it helps a promising young mind. He listens carefully as Marcus explains his desire to become a lawyer, to fight the injustices he witnesses daily. Mr. Richardson nods slowly, as if weighing Marcus's sincerity. Then he smiles, warm and encouraging. He talks about historical cases, about lawyers who confronted states determined to maintain segregation. He mentions scholarships offered by organizations sympathetic to the movement, small cracks in the wall that Marcus might slip through if he's clever and persistent. That evening, Marcus pores over the notes he took, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He thinks of Mr. Daniels and his store, of the fear in the community's eyes each time a white official steps onto their streets. He thinks of the books he's read about constitutional rights, about the promises supposedly enshrined in law that too many Americans have yet to see honored. He realizes that every act of discrimination he witnesses, every uneasy glance between neighbors of different races, every cruel word muttered by those who think they own the world, all of it fuels his resolve. He understands now that he can't simply hope for change. He must become an instrument of that change. This is no longer about personal ambition or a stable career. This is about justice itself. If he can earn the right degrees, learn the language of the court, and stand before a judge to argue that his people are as worthy of equality as anyone else, perhaps he can make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, the next time men in uniforms come to threaten a neighbor, Marcus will be there in a suit and tie, armed with laws and precedents that force them to back down. The spark has ignited into a steady flame. He will become the lawyer they never saw coming, and he will do it not just for himself, but for everyone who has ever felt the sting of a system rigged against them. He finds himself standing at the edge of a moment he will remember for the rest of his life. It is early afternoon, and a lazy sun drifts overhead, its warm rays doing little to ease the tension in the atmosphere. He has just turned 17, no longer a child, but not yet a man in the eyes of those who hold power. He is making his way home along a route he knows by heart, the cracked sidewalks, the leaning fences, and the uneasy stares that follow him whenever he passes certain corners of town. He walks with a book tucked under his arm, something about constitutional law that he managed to borrow from a sympathetic neighbor. He's been reading it hungrily, absorbing words that feel both distant and oddly personal, as if every principle on the page whispers that the world could be different if only people knew how to insist on their rights. He approaches a small diner that sits at the border between the black and white sections of the city. This diner has always been an unsettling landmark. Marcus has never eaten there, he knows the rules. A sign near the entrance, faded but still legible, spells out who is welcome and who is not. For years he has passed by and pretended not to care. Today, something is different. He hears voices raised inside, sharp words cutting through the stillness. He slows his steps, heart pounding, uncertain whether to keep going or to pause and bear witness. He stops just short of the window, staying half hidden behind the trunk of an old oak. Inside, he can see a black woman standing near the counter. She looks exhausted but determined, her back straight as if the weight of 1,000 injustices rests on her shoulders. The waitress behind the counter, a young white woman, appears nervous, glancing over her shoulder at a man in a pressed shirt who must be the manager. The manager's face is set in a grim line. He points at the sign, at the woman's face, and then says something Marcus cannot fully hear. Whatever it is hurtful. The woman's jaw tightens. She does not leave. Marcus admires her courage instantly, even as fear prickles along his own spine. Time stretches out. The manager steps from behind the counter and looms over the woman. He tries to appear calm and authoritative, but Marcus can sense the cruelty beneath the surface. The woman speaks quietly, her words too soft for Marcus to catch, but he can guess her meaning. She is asking why she cannot be served here like anyone else, why her money, her dignity, her very presence must be scorned. The manager shakes his head, and Marcus sees the waitress bite her lip, her eyes shining with something like shame. The silence that follows is thick, broken only by the scrape of a chair as another customer stands to watch. Marcus's chest feels tight. He wants to rush in, to stand beside this woman, to tell the manager that this is wrong in every possible way. He wants to quote something from the book he's been reading, some line about equal protection under the law. But he is just a teenager, an outsider peering in. If he steps inside, there's no telling what might happen. He could be thrown out, arrested, beaten. 1,000 tragedies have started with a scene like this. Yet, as he watches, he also realizes that this exact moment is what has been fueling his desire to become a lawyer. The raw injustice playing out before his eyes, the cruelty dressed up as normalcy, the silence of bystanders who know better but do nothing, this is precisely what he hopes to confront one day. The woman inside knows her worth, and yet the world tries to deny it. Marcus wants to be the one who takes such a scene into a courtroom, who demands that the country's promises not remain hollow words. After several agonizing seconds, the manager steps closer to the woman, voice raised, his posture threatening. Marcus's fists clench. He cannot stand by any longer. He steps out from behind the oak, determined at least to make his presence known. Just as he's about to reach for the door, another man appears, older, black, with careful eyes and a steady gait. He approaches from the opposite side of the street, calling out to the woman by name. Perhaps he's a neighbor or a community leader. Whatever his role, his voice carries calm authority. The manager hesitates, intimidated by the quiet certainty in the newcomer's tone. The woman at the counter takes a half step back, as if gathering her strength. Marcus doesn't move inside, but he lingers near the window, heart still hammering. He senses that the tension may dissipate now that more witnesses have arrived. The manager seems less certain, aware that too large an audience might cause trouble for himself. He mutters something, points at the door. The woman turns, head held high, and leaves without being served. Her face is composed but pained. The older man offers her his arm, and together they walk away, their footsteps echoing softly. Marcus watches them go, 1,000 thoughts rushing through his mind. If he were a lawyer right now, what would he do? He would take them to a place where reason and justice mattered, where the word of a single diner manager couldn't strip someone of their dignity. He would file a lawsuit, argue in front of a judge, present evidence that discrimination is not only immoral but illegal. He'd demand that the country live up to the principles it claims to hold dear. The very idea fills him with a fierce longing. He's tired of feeling helpless. He's tired of letting fear and unwritten rules dictate who can sit where, who can eat what, who can hold their head up in public without being shamed. That evening, he returns to the community center and finds the Reverend and Mr. Richardson waiting, as if they knew he needed to talk. He describes what he saw at the diner, the chill it sent through him, and the flare of resolve it ignited. They listen with understanding. The Reverend says softly that scenes like this play out daily, that change comes slowly, but it does come. Mr. Richardson encourages Marcus, saying that every lawyer who ever fought for civil rights started by witnessing an injustice and deciding it could not stand. Marcus nods, tears of frustration and determination prickling at his eyes. He is more certain now than ever that his path leads him to a courtroom, to arguments and verdicts and laws revised. He wants to stand between the powerless and those who would abuse them, to channel his rage and sadness into a force that rights wrongs rather than simply lamenting them. As night falls and Marcus heads home, he cannot forget the look on that woman's face or the manager's sneer. He cannot forget how the waitress lowered her gaze, too scared to defy her boss. He cannot forget the silence of the other customers, who watched as if it were a performance rather than an affront to human decency. But most of all, he cannot forget how it felt to be a helpless observer, wanting so badly to speak up and force respect into that small, hateful room. He vows silently that this will not remain his role. He will return to places like that diner armed with knowledge and authority. He will fight so that the next time someone stands at a counter demanding to be treated like a human being, they won't have to leave empty-handed. This promise, born of anger and compassion, will guide him forward. The summer air felt heavier than ever, as if each breath Marcus took carried the weight of all those who came before him. He had grown used to the quiet fury that simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. Every step through his neighborhood offered a reminder: the separate water fountains, the back doors he and his family were forced to use, the scowls and muttered insults that he had learned to ignore since childhood. Yet, there were moments when ignoring no longer seemed possible, when the cruelty of segregation struck like a sudden slap, leaving him shaken and furious. Late one afternoon, as he walked home from the community center, he heard raised voices spilling out from an alleyway near the old grocery store. Instinct told him to steer clear, but a knot of curiosity and concern pulled him closer. He rounded the corner and froze. A young black man, someone Marcus had seen around but didn't know by name, stood backed against a brick wall, his hands raised defensively. Facing him were two white police officers. Their uniforms gleamed in the fading sunlight, and their holstered weapons seemed to loom larger than life. Marcus could not hear everything they said, but he caught enough: slurs that twisted his stomach, accusations that the man didn't belong in that part of town. Marcus's blood ran cold. He recognized the man's fearful eyes, his trembling voice, as he tried to explain he was only passing through, that he had every right to walk these streets. Marcus's heart pounded. This wasn't a subtle slight at a diner or a condescending glance at a store. This was raw power enforcing an ugly lie. Before he could think, he blurted out, "He's done nothing wrong." The sound of his own voice startled him. The officers whipped around. One of them glared, took a step forward, and snarled something about minding his own business. Marcus felt fear flooding his limbs, but he did not back away. He thought of his dreams of becoming a lawyer, of standing in a courtroom to shield the vulnerable. Yet, here he was, a teenager with only his voice. He tried again, insisting the man had the right to be here. The officer's face twitched with anger, his jaw clenched as if deciding what to do with this young troublemaker who dared to interfere. Time stretched thin. The other officer glanced over his shoulder, as if worried someone else might appear. Perhaps a crowd might gather. Perhaps they did not want witnesses. After a tense, silent moment, they shoved the young man forward, growled a warning to both of them, and stormed off. Marcus could feel their contempt lingering like a sour smell. The man lowered his hand slowly, eyes shining with disbelief and relief. He thanked Marcus softly, voice shaky, before hurrying away down the alley, as though each second near this place still posed a threat. Marcus stood alone, heart thudding, fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to scream. He wanted to shout at the sky that this was wrong, that this had been wrong his entire life, and that he would no longer sit by and do nothing. He had always known he wanted to be a lawyer, But in that charged moment, the decision crystallized with a force he had never felt before. He understood now that law was not just about reading books or arguing in fancy courtrooms. It was a shield that too few people had ever been allowed to hold. He wanted to learn every statute, every clause that could be wielded like a sword against such blatant hatred. He wanted to stand before judges and juries and demand that his community no longer be treated as intruders in their own town. That night, he spoke to his parents, voice trembling with passion as he recounted what he had seen. His father's eyes darkened at the tale, and his mother pressed a hand over her heart. They had always encouraged him to strive for more, to trust his instincts. Now, seeing the conviction in his gaze, they nodded. If becoming a lawyer was his path, they would support him, even if the journey seemed impossible. Marcus also confided in Mrs. Coleman, his teacher. She looked at him with pride shining in her eyes. He told her about the alley, about the terror on that man's face, about how he wanted the words of the law to be his tools so he could defend people who had no one else. She reached out, gently touching his arm. "Marcus, your voice can change things," she said softly. "If the law has been used to oppress, it can also be used to liberate." A few days later, the reverend at the church introduced Marcus to another mentor, a local pastor who worked quietly behind the scenes to connect promising students with scholarships and activist networks. This pastor, a warm-hearted woman with a sharp mind, nodded gravely as Marcus explained his resolve. She promised to guide him, to help find the right colleges, the right opportunities to launch him toward law school. Marcus felt humbled and grateful. He was not alone in this fight. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed something changing inside him. Every instance of subtle or open discrimination he witnessed only fueled his determination. He spent late nights reading whatever materials he could find, trying to understand how the legal system worked and where people like him fit into it. He practiced speaking in front of a mirror, imagining himself delivering arguments that would force the world to reckon with its own injustices. He connected with community elders who had lived through even harsher times and absorbed their stories, their hopes, their warnings. Through it all, a quiet but powerful community formed around him, family members who sacrificed and encouraged, mentors who offered guidance, neighbors who looked at him with cautious admiration. He was just one young man in a world designed to keep him down, but he felt a tide rising inside him. He knew that from this point forward, there would be no turning back. He had found his purpose, ignited by the cruelty he refused to accept. And so, though he was still the same Marcus who once quietly read old textbooks by lamplight, he now carried something new, a spark that would guide him through every trial ahead until he could stand tall, a lawyer and advocate, tearing down the barriers that had kept his people in the dark for far too long. He is 17 now, standing on the threshold between dreams and their realization. High school is nearing its end, and Marcus feels like he's racing against time, pushing himself through every assignment, every exam, determined not just to pass, but to excel. There is a subtle shift in how a few of his teachers treat him. Some still hold onto the old assumptions, quietly implying that a young black man should aim for modest goals, but others, like Mrs. Coleman, sense the fire inside him and do what they can to nurture it. They recommend extra readings, slip him information about summer programs, or mention, in careful whispers, organizations up north that help black students apply to integrated colleges. Marcus drinks in this knowledge, storing it like water in a desert, knowing he will need every drop. He often studies in the school's cramped library, a small room with shelves of aging textbooks and a handful of worn chairs. The librarian, Miss Turner, is kind enough to let him stay until she locks up. The dusty afternoon light filters through narrow windows, and as other students hurry home, Marcus lingers, leafing through law journals he barely understands yet. It doesn't matter that the language is dense and the concepts complex. He is training his mind to parse these arguments, to see how ideas are built and defended. He imagines himself in law school, sitting in a lecture hall surrounded by students who never had to fight for a decent education. He won't let their head starts discourage him. Instead, he vows to meet them word for word, idea for idea. He will prove that brilliance can arise from any corner, even one that society tries to keep in shadow. On weekends, while other teenagers hang out at the local soda shop or watch movies at the segregated theater, relegated to the balcony, of course, Marcus works odd jobs. He cleans yards, hauls crates at a market stall, helps elderly neighbors with chores. He saves every penny. He knows that applying to college will cost money, application fees, postage, maybe trips to interviews. His parents do what they can, but money is always tight. Sometimes he catches his mother looking at him with a mixture of pride and worry, as if she's afraid that these dreams might break him if they don't come true. He understands her fear, but he cannot let it weaken his resolve. Instead, he works harder, assures her he will find a way. By now, the community has heard about his ambitions. Some shake their heads. He's getting ideas above his station, they say, concerned for his safety, for the heartbreak he might face. Others quietly encourage him, slipping him newspaper clippings about civil rights lawyers who fought and won important cases. He collects these stories, pinning them in his mind like bright flags on a map, each one a beacon that says, yes, this can be done. Yes, it's possible. As graduation nears, Marcus meets again with Mr. Richardson and the Reverend, who have gathered pamphlets and information on historically black colleges and universities that might welcome a student like him. They also mention the possibility of applying to integrated institutions if he's willing to endure the tension of being one of the few, or perhaps the first, African American students there. Marcus's heart flips at the idea. The challenge is enormous, but the potential impact is too significant to ignore. Imagine attending a university where he could access a world-class law library, where he could learn from renowned professors, even if some of them might resent his presence. If he succeeds, he would carve out a path others could follow, leaving behind footprints that say, your place in the world is not fixed by anyone's prejudice. He sends letters, carefully typed on a borrowed typewriter, to various colleges. He explains his background, his goals, his determination to practice law and defend the rights of those who have so long been denied them. He triple-checks his grammar and spelling, worried that a single mistake might give someone an excuse to discard his application. He includes every honor he's received, top of his class, debate club participant, math team member. He mentions the volunteer work he's done at the community center, tutoring younger kids in basic reading and arithmetic. His hands shake when he mails these envelopes, each one a small prayer sent into a world he has never fully entered. While waiting for responses, he seeks out scholarship information. The costs of college loom large, and he knows his family cannot shoulder the burden alone. He reads about organizations that sponsor gifted students from disadvantaged backgrounds, about funds set aside by philanthropic groups who believe in education as a tool for social change. He applies to everything he can find, pouring his heart into essays that describe not only his ambitions but the grit and resilience that have shaped him. Days turn into weeks, and the air crackles with anticipation. Marcus heads to the mailbox every afternoon, heart-pounding, scanning the letters for university logos or return addresses from scholarship committees. Sometimes he is met with disappointment, a polite rejection letter that regrets to inform him that they cannot accept him at this time. He feels the sting, his shoulders sagging for a moment. But he picks himself up, reminding himself that one rejection is not the end. He simply cannot afford despair. Then one day, a thick envelope arrives from a college that, while modest in size, has a growing reputation for welcoming students who challenge the status quo. Inside is an acceptance letter. Marcus almost can't believe his eyes. They welcome him to join their next freshman class, stating that his academic record and personal statement stood out. And below that, a note about a partial scholarship. He reads the words twice, 3 times, as if they might vanish if he looks away. He rushes inside to share the news with his parents. His mother cries softly, pressing a hand to her mouth, while his father nods, pride shining in his eyes. This is not a full ride and not a prestigious Ivy League institution, but it is a door cracked open, and Marcus can see beyond it a future that once seemed impossible. He knows he will have to work part-time jobs on campus, watch his expenses closely, and keep his grades high enough to maintain any financial aid. He knows, too, that once he arrives at this college, he will face new forms of subtle and blatant discrimination. But that no longer frightens him. He has a goal that is bigger than any humiliation he might face. Before he sleeps that night, Marcus places the acceptance letter under his pillow, as if it were a ticket to a better world. He dreams of tall bookcases lined with law textbooks, of heated debates in lecture halls, of meeting other young minds who share his hunger for change. He dreams, too, of returning to his community someday, briefcase in hand, ready to argue cases that matter, to lift others as he has been lifted. He is stepping onto a new road now, one paved with long hours of study, financial tightropes, and the constant challenge of standing out in a world that often resents difference. But he will not be deterred. The educational journey he has yearned for is finally beginning, and he is determined to succeed, not just for himself, but for everyone who dared to believe in him and for all those who need an advocate who knows their struggle firsthand. He arrives on campus with a single suitcase and a heart full of quiet determination. It is his first day of college, and everything feels at once larger, brighter, and more intimidating than he imagined. The dormitories rise up before him, old brick buildings shaded by broad oaks, and the hum of new students mingling and laughing reaches his ears. He can't help but notice how few of the faces around him look like his, how most people pass without a second glance, absorbed in their own excitement. But Marcus, standing on these manicured lawns for the first time, carries a sense of purpose that steadies him. He didn't come this far to be daunted by unfamiliar hallways or polite but distant stares. He came to learn, to climb that mountain toward law school and arm himself with knowledge that could reshape destinies. His roommate, David, greets him with a friendly nod. David is white, from a middle-class family in the Northeast, and seems genuinely curious about Marcus's background. They chat awkwardly at first. Marcus is wary, not sure if David's kindness runs deep or if it's just surface politeness. But over time, Marcus notices that David doesn't flinch at honest conversations. When Marcus mentions that he aims to become a lawyer fighting for civil rights, David leans forward, interested. He asks questions instead of offering canned sympathy. It's a small but meaningful relief. Classes begin, and Marcus discovers that college demands more than just raw intelligence. It requires a marathoner's stamina. He rises early to secure a spot in the library's quiet corner, where he pores over complex readings in political science, history, and philosophy. The textbooks are expensive, and he often opts for used copies, their margins filled with other students' notes. He works a part-time job in the cafeteria, wiping down tables and carrying trays, earning just enough to cover supplies and a bit of food beyond the cafeteria fare. Sometimes, after hours of lectures and dishwashing, he collapses into bed too tired to dream. Still, he refuses to complain. Every page he reads, every lecture he absorbs, brings him one step closer to understanding the laws and structures he must one day confront. He quickly realizes that many professors presume their students have already been exposed to certain ideas or have had the luxury of travel and cultural experiences he never had. When they drop references to authors or events he's never heard of, Marcus takes frantic notes, determined to fill these gaps. If it means extra time in the library looking up obscure cases, so be it. If it means keeping his head down when a professor's offhand remarks suggest low expectations for students like him, he transforms that slight into fuel. Outside of class, he gravitates toward groups that value debate and critical thinking. He finds a small circle of politically minded students, black, white, and otherwise, who meet in a cramped common room to discuss the civil rights movement unfolding beyond the campus gates. They talk about the freedom rides, the sit-ins, and the legal battles being waged in courts across the South. Marcus listens more than he speaks at first, but as weeks pass, he shares his own experiences, his motivations. The group appreciates his perspective, and he feels, for the first time, that he belongs to a community driven by ideals rather than fear. In his second year, he stumbles across a flyer announcing a panel discussion featuring a visiting civil rights lawyer. It feels like fate. The evening of the event, he hurries to an auditorium half filled with curious students and a handful of faculty members. On stage, the lawyer, a poised African-American woman with a calm, confident voice, speaks about challenging discriminatory voting laws. She describes standing in courtrooms where every eye seemed hostile and yet pressing on with her arguments until even the hardest hearts had to acknowledge facts and legal precedents. Marcus sits near the back, eyes shining, hanging on every word. He realizes that what he imagines doing with his life is not a fantasy. People are already doing it, paving the way, and he can follow in their footsteps. After the panel, he musters the courage to approach her. He stammers a bit, overwhelmed by admiration, but manages to ask what he should focus on if he wants to pursue law and civil rights. She regards him kindly, encourages him to read widely and get involved in local advocacy. "Don't wait until law school to start making a difference," she says. "There are grassroots organizations, local legal aid clinics, places where you can learn how the law intersects with everyday struggles." She hands him a business card, not promising anything specific, but the gesture alone makes him feel seen. True to her advice, Marcus seeks out a local community center that provides basic legal information to those who can't afford lawyers. He volunteers to help with paperwork, to greet clients, to listen to their problems. He can't give legal advice, he's just an undergraduate student, but he learns how the system looks from the ground level. He sees families terrified of eviction, workers cheated out of wages, tenants dealing with unsafe conditions. He watches volunteer lawyers attempt to guide these individuals through a maze of forms and requirements. Marcus absorbs it all, silent and determined, like a sponge soaking up what textbooks never fully convey, the emotional toll and the urgency behind every legal struggle. Meanwhile, he pours himself into his studies. By junior year, he's taking more specialized classes in American government, constitutional law, and ethics. He writes papers that challenge the status quo, pushing himself to build arguments grounded in evidence and logic. Sometimes professors praise his insights, other times they remain aloof, as if unsure what to make of a student who defies the stereotypes they may hold. Marcus doesn't mind. He's here to learn, to sharpen his reasoning, to prepare himself for law school admissions, which loom on the horizon like a great mountain range he must cross. He knows that entering law school will require excellent grades, strong recommendations, and a compelling personal statement. So he cultivates relationships with a few professors who respect his dedication. He visits them during office hours to discuss class materials, to ask for guidance on improving his essays, and occasionally to speak about the moral implications of law. Over time, some of these professors begin to see him not as a curiosity but as a scholar in his own right, a young man who will, one day, leave his mark on the profession. As graduation from college approaches, Marcus feels a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. He has navigated an environment that was never designed for someone of his background, and he has not only survived, he has thrived. His GPA is impressive, his extracurricular involvement shows leadership and commitment, and he saved just enough money to cover application fees to several respected law schools. Some of his friends celebrate early job offers and internships at their parents' companies. Marcus looks instead toward the path he's chosen, long years of study, more loans or scholarships to find, and then the daunting reality of entering a law school where he might, once again, be in the minority. But that doesn't scare him anymore. Instead, it inspires him. Every step he takes now is propelled by a deeper understanding of who he is and what he must do. One warm spring evening, as the sun sets over the campus lawns, Marcus sits beneath a tree with his books piled beside him. The scent of new blossoms drifts through the air. He closes his eyes, envisioning himself in a law library, poring over case law late into the night. He imagines presenting arguments before seasoned professors who test his every assumption. He sees, years down the line, a courtroom where he will speak on behalf of those who never thought their voices would carry weight. In that quiet moment, he feels not only the uncertainty of the road ahead, but also a profound sense of readiness. He's come so far, and the next step, law school, is within reach. He will not falter. He will harness everything he has learned in this place and use it to break through the barriers that have stood for generations. He watches the mailbox daily now, just as he did when he first applied to college. Only this time, the stakes are higher. He's applying to a carefully chosen list of law schools, some renowned for their academic rigor, others known for their progressive values. He's poured his heart into personal statements that recount his journey, from a segregated childhood in the South to the late nights in underfunded libraries and cramped dorm rooms, always striving for more. He's emphasized his passion for civil rights, for using the law as a tool to dismantle discrimination and protect the vulnerable. Still, he knows the world can be unforgiving. He braces himself for rejections, reminding himself that he's faced long odds before. When the acceptance letters begin to trickle in, he feels both relief and wonder. A few schools turn him down politely, citing intense competition. But others, including a prominent law school with a growing reputation for supporting civil rights advocacy, send envelopes thick with orientation packets and scholarship offers. He chooses one that strikes a balance: respected faculty, a track record of producing civil rights lawyers, and some financial aid to help shoulder the burden of tuition. He signs the acceptance form with a steady hand, knowing that he's about to step into a new world, one where the challenges will be even more formidable. On the day he arrives at law school, the campus feels both familiar and utterly foreign. He's gotten used to being a minority in academic spaces, but law school is another level. He notices the tailored suits on some students who come from families of lawyers and judges, the way they chat easily about connections and clerkships before they've even attended their first class. He swallows the prick of intimidation. He may not have their pedigree, but he has something else: a fire forged in hardship, a deep understanding of why the law matters, and for whom it often fails. His first classes hit like a tidal wave of complexity. Professors speak quickly, challenging students to reason through case law with precision. Assigned readings stack up by the day. There's a pressure here unlike anything he's known before. Some classmates seem confident, tossing around legal terminology as if they were born speaking it. Marcus sits quietly at first, absorbing every detail, mapping the intellectual landscape. He knows he can catch up, surpass even, if he's willing to work twice as hard. He quickly learns that the law can be both elegant and cruel. In constitutional law seminars, he reads about cases that shaped the nation's understanding of equality. Some rulings fill him with hope, others leave him shaking with anger at how courts have sometimes upheld unfair systems. In criminal procedure, he sees how the justice system can be tilted against certain communities. He recognizes how crucial it will be to master these doctrines if he hopes to bend them toward justice in the future. He also faces microaggressions and outright skepticism. A few classmates question, subtly or blatantly, whether he belongs here. He overhears comments about those kinds of students who only got in due to affirmative action, never mind his outstanding academic record. Rather than lash out, he channels this frustration into motivation. He will show them what he's capable of. Each time he's tempted to give up, he remembers the narrow alleys and dusty roads of his youth, the trembling hands of a neighbor threatened by authorities, the woman refused service at the diner, the man harassed in the alleyway by police. Those memories keep him steady, remind him that he's here for a purpose much larger than his own pride. He finds refuge in a small group of classmates who share similar values. Among them are students who also overcame obstacles, some from different backgrounds, others who felt the sting of prejudice in different forms. Together, they study late into the night in a secluded corner of the law library, exchanging notes, summarizing cases, quizzing each other before exams. They joke about the intensity of their workload, but beneath the humor is a shared determination. They intend not just to become lawyers, but to shape the law so it reflects the principles of justice that so many courts have claimed to uphold. Marcus also seeks out mentors. There's a professor who teaches civil rights litigation, an older man who marched in protests during his youth and now devotes his career to teaching young minds how to use the law as a shield for the powerless. Marcus approaches him after class one day, voice respectful but eager. To his relief, the professor seems genuinely interested in his story. He offers office hours not just for academic questions, but to discuss strategies for Marcus's career, how to get internships at organizations fighting for desegregation, voting rights, or fair housing. Under this professor's guidance, Marcus begins to see how the abstract theories and textbooks can become practical tools in court. He applies for and wins a summer internship at a local legal aid organization. It's unpaid, but he's able to secure a modest grant from the school's public interest fund. At this small office downtown, he sits with attorneys who juggle dozens of cases on behalf of clients who have no money to pay for representation. He helps draft motions, researches precedent, and watches as these lawyers do their best with limited time and resources. He admires their resilience. Their clients remind him of people back home, people who never had anyone stand up for them in a legal setting. Each case he touches, even if just assisting with minor research, feels like a step closer to his goal. The workload at law school never eases. Nights still stretch long into the early morning, his desk piled high with casebooks, his eyes gritty with exhaustion. Yet, he thrives in this challenge. He raises his hand in class more often now, pressing professors on the implications of decisions that quietly sanction discrimination. He engages in debates with classmates who believe the law should be colorblind without acknowledging the structural inequalities that have long been baked into the system. His arguments become sharper, more precise, carried by moral conviction and honed by careful study. As he approaches the end of his first year, he reflects on how far he has come. He remembers the dusty roads of his childhood, the worn textbooks, and the scornful eyes of people who thought he'd never amount to much. Now, he's reading Supreme Court opinions, analyzing legal doctrines, and earning respect from peers who once underestimated him. He's not naive. He knows the real battles lie ahead, in courtrooms and negotiations, and legislative changes and community organizing. But he's closer than ever to becoming the lawyer he dreamed of being. He can feel it in the way he grasps complex legal principles and how his voice no longer wavers when he makes a point in class. He stands at his dorm window late one evening, looking out at the campus bathed in moonlight. This place is just another stepping stone, he thinks. Law school is training him to enter the world fully armed with the understanding and authority to challenge unjust laws and defend his people's rights. He still remembers the fear, the helplessness he felt as a boy, as a teen, watching the world deny basic dignity to those he cared about. He can't turn back now. Every sacrifice, every hour spent bent over dense legal texts, every awkward conversation and subtle insult endured, is making him stronger. He's forging himself into the advocate he was always meant to be. He advances through the rigorous program one semester at a time, accumulating not just legal knowledge, but also a sense of strategy and moral clarity. Each new course, Constitutional Law 2, Advanced Civil Rights Litigation, Legal Ethics, adds layers to his understanding. He begins to see patterns in the legal system, fault lines along which injustices form. Where once he only sensed something wrong, now he can name it, trace its lineage through precedent, and imagine a way to challenge it in court. The library remains his sanctuary, and as second and third year unfold, he often stays well past midnight, reading under dim lamps, practicing arguments under his breath, preparing for the battles he will one day wage outside these walls. Summer internships become a chance to test his skills in the real world. In his second summer, he secures a position at a civil rights organization known for challenging unfair voter registration laws. This takes him to the heart of communities struggling to maintain their right to vote against intimidation, misinformation, and bureaucratic hurdles designed to silence their voices. He accompanies experienced lawyers on field visits, sitting quietly at tables in church basements and community centers, listening as people describe how they've been turned away from polling places or asked to produce ID cards they can't possibly obtain. Marcus takes detailed notes, his mind racing with legal strategies. He feels the gratitude in these neighborhoods and also their desperation. It only strengthens his resolve. Back at law school for his final year, he takes on leadership roles in student organizations dedicated to social justice. He volunteers at a local free legal clinic, offering basic guidance to tenants facing eviction. This exposure is transformative. While he knew in theory how laws could harm or help, now he sees it firsthand, family by family, story by story. He helps prepare simple forms, explains legal concepts in plain language, and even if he can't fix every problem, he eases anxieties by showing people that someone cares, that the law isn't just for those with money and influence. Professors notice his dedication and recommend him for prestigious fellowships. Classmates who once seemed skeptical now ask him to review their arguments, to help them see angles they missed. He's earned respect through quiet, consistent excellence. As the end of law school approaches, Marcus begins applying for positions that align with his mission. Many of his peers are drawn to corporate law firms offering high salaries and polished offices. Marcus looks elsewhere. He wants to join a legal defense fund, a nonprofit that directly confronts the legacy of racism and inequality in housing, employment, education, and the criminal justice system. He sends out applications that read more like manifestos, stating clearly that he intends to use his degree to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. He knows this may narrow his options. Not every employer is comfortable with such overt passion. But he can't pretend he's just another graduate looking for prestige. He has a calling, and he trusts that the right organization will value that fire. In the spring of his final year, he stands before a crowd of peers in a moot court competition. This is not just a classroom exercise. Prestigious judges from nearby courts have come to watch, and law firms send representatives to scout talent. The case involves a challenge to a city's restrictive housing ordinances, which have quietly displaced minority families for decades. Marcus is assigned to argue on behalf of the plaintiffs, people who have been pushed out of their homes by ever-shifting regulations designed to favor wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. He speaks calmly at first, laying out the legal framework, citing previous decisions, and building his reasoning step by step. Then, as he reaches the heart of his argument, he allows some emotion to surface. He describes the human cost, the children uprooted from their schools, the elders forced into longer commutes, and poor health outcomes. He ties these personal stories back to the law, illustrating that statutes can never be neutral when they're written and enforced by those who refuse to see the humanity of all citizens. The judges ask hard questions, probing for weaknesses. Marcus responds with clarity and conviction, weaving facts and precedents together so tightly that it's hard to pull them apart. Afterward, as he exits the courtroom, he hears murmurs of admiration from classmates and even from a few skeptical onlookers. He doesn't strut or boast. He simply smiles, knowing that he's done what he came here to do, stand up for justice, even if only in a simulated setting. Soon he will do this for real, in courts where the outcome matters not just to grades, but to actual lives. Graduation day arrives, a warm afternoon where the sun glints off the gowns and caps of hundreds of students. Marcus's parents have made the journey, sitting proudly in the audience. They watch their son cross the stage and accept his diploma, tears shining in their eyes. They remember the dusty streets and old textbooks, the evenings he spent reading by weak lamplight, the times he confided that he felt scared or overwhelmed. Now he stands taller, more assured, carrying a degree that few in his community ever imagined earning. It's more than personal achievement, it's a beacon for others who might follow. Shortly after commencement, he receives an offer letter from a renowned civil rights legal defense fund. They know of his background, his academic record, and the internships that put him in direct contact with the communities he hopes to serve. They welcome his passion and offer him a modest salary and a mountain of challenging cases. He accepts without hesitation. The fancy offices and big salaries of corporate law never enticed him. He's heading exactly where he needs to go. A week before he's set to move to the city where he'll start this new job, Marcus returns to his old neighborhood. He walks those familiar streets, sees how much has and hasn't changed. The separate water fountains are gone, at least officially, but inequalities still loom large. He visits Mr. Daniels' store, long since integrated, though it still struggles financially. He stops by the community center, where children now have slightly better textbooks, thanks in part to grants and a few tireless advocates. He talks quietly with the Reverend and Mr. Richardson, thanking them for setting him on this path. They smile, proud and hopeful, their faith in him vindicated. As dusk settles, Marcus finds himself standing beneath the old oak tree that once hid him as he watched injustice unfold at the diner. He remembers the terrified woman who was denied service, the fear in her eyes, and his own helpless rage. Tonight, he vows again that his life's work will honor the courage of those who dared to demand respect, who refused to accept second-class treatment. He can't change the past, but he can help shape the future, case by case, argument by argument, until the law reflects a fuller measure of humanity. He leaves his hometown the next morning, suitcase in hand, heading toward a career that will test him in every way. He knows he will face setbacks, disappointments, and even threats. Yet he also knows that every time he steps into a courtroom, every time he drafts a brief, challenging, and unjust policy, he will carry within him the hopes of his parents, teachers, mentors, and neighbors. He will stand not just as Marcus, the lawyer, but as a symbol that resilience, education, and moral courage can transform even the most rigid barriers. And that, after all this striving, might be the truest victory of all. He steps into the small, modest office of the Legal Defense Fund for his first day as a practicing attorney. The building is old, nestled in a part of town that doesn't see much investment. Paint peels from the doorframe, and the waiting room's chairs are mismatched. But to Marcus, it feels like a command center for justice. He has earned his right to be here. Countless late-night study sessions, personal sacrifices, and burning passion have all led him through that door. The staff welcomes him warmly. Many are seasoned lawyers who started their careers when the civil rights movement was still young, and others are energetic newcomers who see in Marcus a kindred spirit. His workload begins modestly. He's assigned to research legal precedents for voting rights cases, assist in drafting motions to challenge discriminatory redistricting, and help prepare arguments for housing discrimination lawsuits. Each assignment is a thread in a larger tapestry aimed at making the law work for everyone, not just the privileged few. He settles at a small desk piled with files and old casebooks. Through the window, he sees a street where children run and play, where workers head home after long shifts. It reminds him of the neighborhoods he grew up in, and it strengthens his resolve. The first time he stands up in a real courtroom as an attorney, his heart pounds. It's a preliminary hearing for a case involving a landlord accused of systematically denying rental units to black families. On the other side of the aisle, a team of well-dressed lawyers represents the property management company. Marcus's firm cannot match their corporate polish or resources, but he has prepared meticulously, armed with evidence of patterns in the landlord's tenant selection. He speaks with measured confidence, laying out the facts. The judge listens carefully. Nothing is decided that day, it's just the beginning, but Marcus leaves the courtroom feeling certain that he has what it takes to stand toe-to-toe with those who think they own the rules. Back at the office, one of the senior attorneys, Ms. Jefferson, gives him a nod of approval. She has been in the trenches for decades and knows how easy it is to become discouraged. She reminds Marcus that true change rarely happens overnight. Lawsuits drag on, appeal after appeal, and sometimes even a victory in court doesn't translate to immediate improvements on the ground. Marcus understands, but he also believes in the cumulative power of each small win, each chink made in the armor of systemic injustice. As months pass, he juggles multiple cases. Some involve blatant discrimination, like employers refusing to hire qualified candidates because of their race. Others are more subtle, cloaked in bureaucratic rules that disproportionately harm communities of color. Marcus learns that fighting these battles involves more than just citing the right cases. It requires telling human stories, showing judges and juries the real human cost of policies that may seem neutral on paper. He reconnects with the local community center, offering free legal workshops on weekends. He explains tenants' rights, the basics of voting laws, and how to file complaints against discriminatory practices. The audience ranges from young parents worried about schools to elderly neighbors unsure if they can trust the system at all. He answers their questions patiently, aware that knowledge is power, and that if people understand their rights, they are harder to victimize. In the evenings, he sometimes feels the weight of the struggle pressing on him. The pay is modest, the hours long, and the victories never feel as complete as he might wish. Even when they win a case, enforcement can be an uphill climb. Sometimes he comes home to a small apartment and sits quietly in the dark, replaying courtroom scenes in his mind, wondering if he chose the right arguments, if he overlooked a key piece of evidence. Doubt and fatigue creep in occasionally, but then he recalls the promise he made to himself, to the memory of his parents' sacrifices, to the dreams forged in underfunded schools and segregated streets. He reminds himself that perfection isn't required, only persistence. Over time, Marcus begins to see patterns. Certain landlords appear in multiple complaints. Certain school boards resist integration measures with subtle tricks. Certain employers continue to find loopholes to justify their biased hiring. He discusses these patterns with his colleagues, and they start to consider broader strategies, perhaps a class action lawsuit or lobbying for legislative changes at the state level. Marcus realizes that while litigation is crucial, true systemic change often requires a combination of legal victories, advocacy, public pressure, and sometimes new laws altogether. Occasionally, he's invited to speak at events, just as that civil rights lawyer once spoke at his college. He stands before students who remind him of his younger self, uncertain, hungry, and skeptical that the world will ever change. He shares his journey, not sugarcoating the difficulties, but emphasizing that progress is possible. He sees hope ignite in their eyes. He understands now that his life is more than just a personal achievement. It's an example that can inspire others to walk similar paths, to pick up torches that have been carried by generations before them. Between court appearances, depositions, and community meetings, the years begin to flow by. Marcus hones his skills, wins some cases outright, settles others, loses a few that he vows to revisit when the law or the courts have shifted. Each case leaves a mark on him, teaching him something new. He becomes adept at navigating legal mazes, spotting the hidden bias in a statute, and framing arguments that appeal not just to the letter of the law, but to the conscience of judges and jurors. He never forgets that first vision he had, standing in a courtroom on behalf of those who had no one else, using the law as both sword and shield. He has lived that vision now, imperfectly, with struggles and compromises, but he has lived it. The segregation signs of his youth have come down, but new challenges always emerge. Systemic racism has deep roots, and pulling them up is the work of lifetimes. Marcus accepts this truth. He understands that no single lawyer, no single lawsuit, will dismantle centuries of injustice. Yet each victory, each precedent set, each person he helps, all add up to a slow but unmistakable movement toward a more just society. As he stands in his office one late afternoon, staring at the framed newspaper clipping announcing a landmark case he helped win, a case that will make it harder for biased landlords to hide behind bureaucratic nonsense, he smiles. He sees the reflection of himself in the glass, older, more seasoned, but still that determined young man who refused to accept the world as it was given to him. He thinks of his parents, of Mrs. Coleman, the Reverend Mr. Richardson, and the mentor lawyers who guided him. He thinks of the countless faces of clients he's tried to help, some emerging triumphant, others still fighting. He knows the work will never be finished, but that's no reason to abandon it. The law can be slow and stubborn, but it can also be reshaped, repurposed, reclaimed. Marcus steps away from the frame and returns to a stack of papers waiting on his desk. Another case, another challenge. The cycle continues. But now he understands something fundamental. Resilience and education didn't just help him rise above his circumstances, they equipped him to pull others up as well. The pursuit of justice amidst systemic racism is a marathon, not a sprint. He has found his stride, and he will keep running, step after step, year after year, forging a legacy that honors where he came from and lights a path for those who follow. He receives a phone call in the middle of the afternoon, the kind that comes without warning. It alters the shape of a life. On the other end is a colleague from a small town a few hours away, someone he met briefly at a legal seminar years ago. The colleague explains that the local school board is refusing to fully comply with a federal desegregation order handed down decades earlier. The board has been using subtle methods, zoning lines that funnel black students into overcrowded schools lacking resources, complicated enrollment processes that deter parents from exercising their legal right to send their children to better facilities. It's a problem that sounds all too familiar, as if history had simply chosen a new disguise. Marcus listens quietly, taking notes, feeling the familiar blend of anger and purpose rise in his chest. He knows this will be a challenging case. School segregation persists in shadows and corners, no longer displayed proudly on signs, but woven into policies and budgets that claim to be race-neutral. Taking on such a case means standing against entrenched interests, school officials who will cite budget constraints, well-paid attorneys who will argue that the district is doing its best, and judges who may be weary of reopening old battles. Still, he cannot say no. Education was the key that unlocked his own potential. Denying a fair education to children simply because of where they live or what they look like is a crime against the future. He tells his colleague he will come as soon as possible to gather evidence, speak with parents, and begin building a case. When he arrives in that small town, he sees the lines drawn in the physical landscape. On one side of the main road, newer facilities gleam with fresh paint, manicured lawns, and modern science labs. On the other, older buildings with cracked sidewalks and faded playground markings reflect decades of neglect. He meets with parents in a church basement, much as he once sat in community meetings as a boy, listening to elders speak about hardship and resilience. Now he is the one taking notes, listening to parents who describe navigating a maze of paperwork that always seems to place their children at a disadvantage. He talks to students who speak softly about feeling unwelcome, about textbooks so outdated they mention politicians long dead and omit major events in recent history. He hears the same quiet heartbreak in their voices that he once felt sitting in overcrowded classrooms with tattered pages. But he also senses hope. These families believe that maybe, with the right legal strategy, they can force the district to comply with the law and give their children a fair chance. He gathers data, comparing class sizes, teacher qualifications, facility conditions. He consults with educational experts who can testify that the disparities are not accidental. He files a suit against the school board, accusing them of perpetuating a pattern of de facto segregation, arguing that the promises made in landmark cases so long ago still have not been fulfilled. It's a bold move. He expects pushback, and he gets it. The district hires a prestigious law firm to represent them, lawyers who grin stiffly as if to say, "We've seen crusaders like you come and go." He ignores their condescension. He's here for the children who have no idea how the law works but know when they're being shortchanged. He's here for the parents who stay up late worrying how their kids will ever compete in a world that offers them less from the start. The courtroom battle unfolds over months. He files motions that meticulously detail the resource gaps, the enrollment hurdles, the statistical patterns that cannot be explained by chance. He calls witnesses, parents who recount trying to enroll their children in a better school only to be turned away with vague explanations, teachers who quietly admit they have fewer supplies, fewer support staff, and larger classes on one side of town. The opposing counsel tries to dismiss these stories as anomalies or the result of socioeconomic factors beyond the district's control. Marcus counters by connecting each thread of evidence into a tapestry that reveals intentional design. He shows that no matter how they spin the narrative, the district's policies have a consistent effect. Black children remain confined to underperforming schools, while white children enjoy an environment rich in opportunities. Every day in court tests his resolve. He returns to his hotel room at night exhausted, reviewing transcripts and planning next steps. He remembers that this is exactly why he became a lawyer, to confront head-on the systems that hold people back. He calls his office for moral support, speaks with Ms. Jefferson, who encourages him to trust the strength of his case and the clarity of his purpose. He reaches out to his parents, who tell him they are proud of him no matter the outcome. He refuels his spirit by recalling his own journey, the segregated streets where he once walked, the quiet libraries where he devoured legal texts, the first time he dared to speak up in a courtroom. All of it has led him here, to this fight. When closing arguments arrive, he takes a measured breath and steps to the podium. He asks the court to recognize that this is not about one child or one family, but about the fundamental promise America made to itself: equal opportunity should not depend on skin color or zip code. He reminds the judge that these parents are not asking for special treatment, just fairness. He insists that the court enforce the laws that already exist to stop the district from sidestepping their legal obligations. He speaks calmly but passionately, his voice reverberating through the silent room. Opposing counsel sneers, mutters something about idealism. Marcus ignores them. He's speaking beyond the lawyers, beyond the officials. He's speaking to the conscience of the judge, the community, and the future. The judge takes weeks to issue a ruling. During that time, Marcus returns to his regular caseload, though he can't shake the tension. He rereads his arguments, wonders if he could have framed a point more persuasively. Doubt whispers in his ear, as it always does. But deep down, he knows he has given everything to this cause. Finally, the decision is released. The court finds that the district's policies constitute de facto segregation and orders comprehensive remedies, revised zoning plans, transparent enrollment procedures, equitable resource allocation. The ruling doesn't solve everything overnight, no court order ever does, but it lays down a marker. Ignoring old inequalities won't be tolerated. This decision sets a precedent that other lawyers and advocates can use in their own fights elsewhere. Marcus stands outside the courthouse steps after reading the opinion. Reporters gather, some curious, some skeptical. He doesn't gloat or celebrate extravagantly. He speaks softly to the microphones, saying that this victory belongs to the families who dared to challenge a rigged system, to the children who deserve nothing less than a real education. He thanks the Legal Defense Fund for trusting him, his mentors for guiding him, and his community for believing that a boy who grew up with second-hand books could one day write new chapters in the ongoing story of justice. Later that evening, after the reporters have gone and the courthouse lights dim, he walks alone under a sky thick with stars. He thinks about how far he has come since those early days, since the first sparks of ambition glowed in his heart. He once was a child in a world that said he was less. Now, he is a man who has helped bend the arc of the universe slightly closer to fairness. He knows there will be more cases, more struggles, because this work never ends. But as long as he has strength, he will keep pushing forward, convinced that every small victory, every grain of progress, matters. He returns to his small office, where a stack of new case files awaits. He smiles tiredly, rolls up his sleeves, and begins reading. His journey proves that resilience, education, and moral courage can uproot even the deepest injustices, one step at a time. He returns to his small apartment late that night, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. Outside, distant sirens hum through quiet streets, and somewhere in the city, families he fought for might be breathing a bit easier, knowing a victory, however incremental, has been won on their behalf. He rereads the court's decision one more time, not for the legal details he already knows by heart, but to remember the feeling of seeing the law respond to truth and conscience. In the weeks following that landmark ruling, Marcus finds himself in a new phase of his career. Younger attorneys from his own organization and from other civil rights groups reach out, asking for guidance on their cases. Law students, some from backgrounds as humble as his once was, write to say they were inspired by his arguments, by the way he insisted that a seemingly invisible injustice be dragged into the light of day. His schedule grows busier, filled not only with his own cases, but with workshops and panels where he shares insights on strategy, on holding institutions accountable, on learning that justice is not a gift but a result of relentless effort. One Saturday morning, he attends a community breakfast organized at a local church. It's the same kind of gathering he once visited as a boy, where neighbors swap stories and search for solutions to everyday struggles. Today, though, he's there as an established civil rights lawyer, one known for tackling tough cases and refusing to accept half measures. Older community members nod respectfully when they see him, some shake his hand, thanking him for what he's done. Younger folks hover around him, curious and hopeful, asking how they, too, can make a difference. He tells them that change comes in many forms. Some will become lawyers, yes, but others will be teachers, activists, writers, entrepreneurs, all contributing to a landscape where equality can flourish. As the breakfast winds down, a young woman with determined eyes and a worn notebook under her arm approaches him. She's a recent college graduate who dreams of going to law school, fueled by the injustices she's seen in her own family's dealings with the housing market. Marcus listens carefully as she describes how her grandmother was denied a home loan decades ago and how that single denial set off a chain of hardships. He recognizes in her voice the same urgency that once pulsed through him. Without hesitation, he offers to review her personal statement, to introduce her to mentors who can guide her through the admissions process, to show her that the path he traveled can indeed be followed by others. Later, he receives an invitation from a legislator's office. There's a new bill under consideration, one that aims to strengthen enforcement of anti-discrimination laws in education and housing. The legislator wants to consult Marcus on its language to ensure that the policy doesn't contain loopholes that could be exploited by those who want to maintain the status quo. Stepping into the realm of legislative advocacy feels like a natural progression. After all, as crucial as lawsuits are, they address one problem at a time. Legislation, if carefully crafted, can shift the foundation upon which injustices rest. He sits in a modest committee room at the state capitol, surrounded by policymakers, lobbyists, and a few nervous interns taking notes. Marcus knows he's not here to charm anyone with false promises. He's here to bring the truth he's seen in courtrooms and neighborhoods to the table. He talks about the patterns he's observed, how discriminatory practices reinvent themselves whenever the law closes one door, and how statutes must be written with precision, foresight, and teeth. Some legislators listen intently, nodding as he outlines the need for robust enforcement mechanisms, transparent data collection, and meaningful penalties for violations. Others seem uneasy, wary of change, muttering about how too strict regulations might cause pushback from certain constituents. He meets their skepticism with calm, reasoned arguments. If the law claims to serve everyone, it must do so sincerely, without hidden paths for discrimination to creep in. While this policy work is new territory, it draws on the same well of resolve Marcus has always tapped. He remembers how, as a boy, he dreamed not just of winning cases, but of helping rewrite the rules so they no longer favored the powerful few. Now he's taken the first steps toward that greater ambition. He's no longer just reacting to injustices, he's trying to anticipate them, to build dams against the tide of prejudice before it floods entire communities. In the evenings, he still works long hours. His office now has a few personal touches, a photograph of his parents, smiling proudly, and a framed newspaper clipping announcing his recent legal victory in the school segregation case. He also keeps a small note on his desk, handwritten by the grandmother of a client he once helped. It says simply, "Thank you for seeing us." These words remind him that, beneath all the legal jargon and policy debates, his work is fundamentally about acknowledgement of humanity, of worth, of the right to stand on equal ground. One day, he's invited back to his old high school, the one with outdated textbooks and limited resources, to speak at a career day. He steps into the hall where he once sat as a restless teenager, hungry for a future he couldn't fully picture. The students gather, some skeptical, others bored, until he begins to speak. He tells them about the long and winding road he took, about the doubts he overcame, about the times he wanted to give up but didn't. He explains that the fight for justice isn't just something from history books, it's alive in their own city, their own neighborhoods. By the time he finishes, their eyes are brighter. He knows not all of them will choose his path, but maybe they'll remember that someone like them rose through the very constraints they now face and found a way to make the system answer for its failings. Weeks pass, and he hears that the legislature is making revisions to the bill he consulted on, incorporating some of his suggestions. If it passes, it might prevent thousands from facing the same obstacles he once fought to dismantle in court. It's a slow, frustrating process. Amendments are added, some well-intentioned, others designed to water down the reforms. Marcus watches this dance of compromise and stands ready to push back when necessary, penning op-eds, giving interviews, ensuring that the public understands what's at stake. For every handful of people resisting change, there are also those who rally behind the cause, inspired by the simple idea that laws should serve all citizens, not just a privileged subset. In these moments, Marcus sees how the different pieces of his life's work fit together: the childhood that taught him resilience, the education that sharpened his mind, the lawsuits that proved discrimination could be confronted, and now the advocacy that might reshape the broader framework of the law. Each chapter has built upon the last. He's not finished, he'll likely never feel truly finished, but he's making progress. And progress, he knows, often comes in increments and partial victories that accumulate over time into something transformative. As dusk falls, he stands on the steps of a government building, watching as lights flick on across the city. He remembers sitting under a different sky, as a young man with only a faint outline of his destiny. Now he can see that destiny more clearly, a life devoted to hammering out equality from stubborn materials, bit by bit, so that future generations won't have to question their worth or their place in the world. He smiles to himself, renewed by the knowledge that this chapter is just another step, another moment in a lifelong commitment to justice. He stands now at a crossroads in his career, the quiet strength he once carried as a student now tempered by the hard-won wisdom of years in the field. The legislative work he's done has begun to bear fruit, portions of the bill he helped shape have passed, and new policies are rolling out across the state. They're not perfect, and he knows full well that policy changes can be slow and uneven, subject to the winds of political change. Still, each success feels like adding a sturdy brick to a wall that can shield future generations from the storms of injustice. His reputation grows beyond his region. Colleagues from other states reach out, asking for his insight on similar battles playing out elsewhere. Sometimes it's a housing discrimination crisis in a northern city, sometimes it's a fight for fair voting access in a rural county down south. Marcus can't personally take every case, but he shares what he's learned, pointing them to legal precedents he's established, encouraging them to use his arguments as templates, as stepping stones. The network of civil rights attorneys begins to feel like a tapestry woven by many hands, each lawyer adding their own thread of resilience and courage. One afternoon, he receives a message from a national civil rights organization. They're assembling a team to challenge a significant case that has reached the appellate courts, one that might end up before the Supreme Court. The case involves subtle yet devastating employment discrimination that, while not overt, systematically excludes qualified black applicants from certain industries. If won, it could set a precedent that redefines how courts understand intent and impact, expanding the tools available to fight systemic racism. Marcus reads the details and understands immediately that this is the kind of legal battle that only comes along once in a generation, one that could redefine entire landscapes of opportunity. He agrees to join the team. It means long nights of strategizing with brilliant minds from across the country. They sit in conference rooms, poring over data and testimony, building arguments that both honor the legacy of past civil rights giants and forge new legal terrain. Marcus contributes not just legal theory, but the grounded perspective that comes from walking the neighborhoods affected by these policies. He insists that they keep the human dimension front and center, never allowing the case to become a sterile debate over technicalities. Every table he sits at, every meeting he attends, he reminds them, behind each statistic is a real person, a family, a life that could be forever altered by the outcome of this case. When he finally stands before a panel of appellate judges to present part of their oral argument, he feels the gravity of the moment. He is no longer the young lawyer trying to prove himself. He is now a seasoned advocate, holding the weight of many communities' hopes in his hands. He begins his argument by acknowledging the complexity of the legal questions before them, then methodically dismantles the notion that discrimination must always be blatant to be real. He shows how these practices, though subtle, carve out channels of inequality through careful design and selective enforcement. He cites historians and economists, psychologists and sociologists, weaving a tapestry of evidence that leaves little room for doubt. He addresses the law itself, pointing to precedent after precedent, and finally appeals to the fundamental principles at the nation's core: equality, fairness, the belief that talent and effort should not be thwarted by prejudice. The courtroom is silent when he finishes. He doesn't know how the judges will rule, but he can sense the impact of his words, the way they have at least stirred something in the room. Outside, as he steps into the crisp air, his co-counsel pats him on the shoulder. They know this is just one step, but it's a step that may lead them toward the highest court in the land. Marcus thinks back to the younger version of himself, the boy who dreamed of using law to change the world. Standing here, he realizes that it's not just about winning cases, it's about shifting perspectives, making the invisible visible, forcing society to confront its own reflection in the mirror of justice. In the following weeks, he balances this monumental case with his ongoing commitments back home. He refuses to abandon the local clients who depend on him. A single mother facing eviction gets the same careful attention he brings to the national legal battle. A group of activists challenging discriminatory policing policies in their neighborhood still receives his guidance. He understands that systemic change and individual advocacy are not separate paths, but intertwined threads. Every person he helps, every small victory he secures, reinforces the moral foundation on which these grander struggles rest. When the appellate decision is finally handed down, it's a mixed outcome. Some aspects favor their arguments, others don't. But crucially, it paves the way for the case to move to the Supreme Court, where a definitive ruling could reshape the legal landscape for decades. The team regroups, gathering renewed energy to present their case to the nation's highest judicial body. Marcus knows this will demand even sharper precision, deeper research, and more rigorous strategy. It may take months, maybe longer, but he's ready. His entire life has prepared him for challenges like this. In the quiet of his apartment late at night, he thinks of all the people, past, present, and future, who have poured their hearts into this struggle. He thinks of the students who once asked how they, too, could make a difference. He envisions a time when young people won't have to argue for their basic rights because the laws will already be firmly on their side. That future isn't guaranteed, but it's closer now than it was when he first dared to dream of it. Marcus sets down his pen and takes a deep breath. Tomorrow he will dive back into the research, the affidavits, the strategic memos. But in this moment, he allows himself to savor the truth that each chapter of his life has built upon the last, leading him from dusty roads and segregated textbooks to legal halls where the fate of entire communities can hinge on the sound of his voice. He rises from the table, determined to keep forging ahead, shaping the law into a tool that can cut through the hardest chains of inequality. He stands outside the Supreme Court building on a crisp morning, the marble pillars rising before him in silent gravity. The air crackles with anticipation. This is a stage he once only imagined from afar, reading about legendary cases in borrowed textbooks, dreaming that one day he might stand here to push the law forward. Now, he's part of a team set to argue a case that could redefine how courts understand discrimination and inequality. Crowds gather quietly behind designated barriers, journalists, supporters from community organizations, curious onlookers hoping to witness history. Marcus can feel their presence even before he sees them, the weight of their hopes pressing gently on his back. Among them are a few faces he recognizes, activists who have fought their entire lives for fair employment practices, old colleagues who traveled hours to stand in solidarity, students clutching notebooks and bright-eyed dreams of their own. He offers them a small, confident nod, then steps inside. The corridors of the Supreme Court seem hushed and timeless. He follows his co-counsel down marble hallways lined with portraits of justices past. His footsteps echo softly, each step a reminder of the distance he's traveled, from segregated streets and ragged textbooks to this solemn temple of law. He recalls the many conversations that shaped this moment, late-night debate sessions in college, quiet encouragement from mentors who believed in him, stern advice from seasoned attorneys who reminded him never to lose sight of the people behind the principles. When the case is called, he takes his seat at counsel's table, smoothing the lapel of his suit. Across from him sit the opposing lawyers, their expressions calm, but he can sense their tension. The justices enter, robed in authority, their faces inscrutable. A hush falls so complete that he can hear the soft rustle of paper as his colleague prepares to speak first. His team's opening argument is delivered by a fellow attorney, an older woman with keen eyes and a steady voice. She lays out the core contention, that policies that produce systematically unequal outcomes, even without explicit intent, can be just as destructive as overt discrimination. The justices listen intently, and when questions come, they are sharp and probing. Marcus takes careful notes, anticipating his turn. When it is Marcus's moment to address the court, he stands, heart steady. He meets the gaze of the justices one by one, then begins, his voice low and clear, building on his colleagues' arguments. He weaves together legal precedent and historical context, demonstrating how discrimination has learned to mask itself in neutral language and hidden processes. He reminds the court that the law must evolve to keep pace with the realities of human ingenuity. Just as oppressors find new ways to maintain hierarchies, so must the law find new ways to dismantle them. Questions come at him in volleys. One justice challenges him on practical enforcement. How can courts distinguish between truly neutral policies and those crafted to yield inequitable results? Another presses him for a limiting principle, worried that acknowledging impact over intent might open floodgates of endless litigation. Marcus addresses each concern methodically, insisting that a careful judicial standard, rooted in evidence and the patterns of outcomes, can strike a balance. He cites social science research, economic models, and past rulings that recognized disparate impact as meaningful evidence of injustice. Throughout it all, he maintains a steady respect, never allowing frustration to creep into his tone. This is the culmination of his life's work, a moment for persuasion, not anger. He feels the quiet strength of everyone who believed in him flowing through his words. He can almost see the faces of his old teachers, his parents, the community elders, each one a reminder that the stakes here are not theoretical. They are as real and urgent as the people who face discrimination every day. When his time concludes, he sits, heart pounding softly in his ears. It will be months before the court issues an opinion. The justices retire to their chambers to weigh the arguments. He steps outside into the sunlight, the crowd murmuring with anticipation. Reporters shout questions, photographers capture his determined expression. He speaks briefly, saying that regardless of the outcome, this case has forced the nation to confront the sophistication of modern-day discrimination and to consider that equality under the law must mean more than just the absence of slurs and open exclusions. It must mean fairness in outcomes, not just in principles. He leaves the court building feeling both exhausted and oddly serene. He has done what he can, and he knows that victory here would not solve all problems at once. Yet a favorable ruling could hand future generations of lawyers and activists a powerful new tool. It could mean that what once hid behind legal fictions would now stand exposed in the courtroom's bright light. Back home, he returns to his office, where fresh cases await and community members still need help navigating everyday injustices. He does not consider himself above these smaller battles. On the contrary, he now understands more clearly than ever that large, historic cases and humble, local struggles form two sides of the same coin. The Supreme Court's decisions matter because they set the framework in which countless individual stories unfold. And those individual stories, in turn, inform the next generation of laws and precedents. In the months to come, he will await the court's ruling with a patience born of long experience. He knows that even if the ruling does not go their way, the work does not end. The movement is bigger than one case, one lawyer, or one moment. But if the decision does affirm their arguments, then an entire new chapter could open for civil rights litigation, making the path just a bit less steep for those who follow. As evening drapes his city in a gentle calm, Marcus sits by his window, watching headlights roll by. He is no longer the young dreamer holding back tears of frustration. He is a seasoned advocate who has seen how resilience, education, and a willingness to fight for others can reshape reality. He has brought his voice into the highest court of the land and given it volume and purpose. Whatever tomorrow brings, he will meet it with the same resolve that carried him from dusty classrooms to marble halls, forging from adversity a well-honed instrument of justice. He waits for months as the court deliberates. Life goes on, cases come and go, and the world keeps spinning with its usual mix of struggle and quiet triumphs. Yet, always at the back of his mind is the monumental question: how will the justices decide? He knows from experience that great change rarely arrives with fanfare, that even a favorable ruling might be couched in cautious language, inviting further battles down the road. But still, he hopes. He hopes for a decision that will carve a more just path for those who have long walked uphill. When the court finally hands down its opinion, the city seems to hold its breath. He reads the decision carefully, heart-pounding. It's a complex ruling, full of nuanced reasoning. The court acknowledges the reality he and his colleagues presented, that discrimination can hide behind policies that appear neutral, that impact can matter as much as intent. In their majority opinion, the justices affirmed that such outcomes cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence, that the law must be equipped to address systemic patterns that deny entire groups the opportunities they deserve. He closes his eyes, letting a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. It is not a total victory, few Supreme Court rulings ever are. The court has placed some limits and called for careful standards, but what matters most is that they have opened the door. They have validated the argument that he and many others have made for so long, that the fight against inequality must adapt to the subtle cunning of those who perpetuate it. This ruling gives future attorneys a sharper instrument, a clearer precedent, a reason to keep pushing. He steps outside into the late morning sun, phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and activists. Some congratulate him, others share cautious optimism. He calls his parents first, letting them know that all those dreams, all those sacrifices, have led to a decision that might help countless families he will never meet. His father's voice catches with emotion, and his mother simply says she always knew he would make a difference. He then makes his way to a community center downtown. A press conference has been arranged, not just by his legal team, but by local leaders who want to celebrate this moment and explain its meaning to ordinary people. He stands beside fellow attorneys, grassroots organizers, and local mothers and fathers who have fought in their own way for fairness. He steps up to the microphone and speaks plainly, without legal jargon, explaining that this is just one step in a long journey. The ruling won't magically erase prejudice, but it arms communities with a stronger shield. It means that those who face discrimination can point to the patterns, show the impact, and demand accountability in a language the courts now recognize. Reporters ask what comes next. He answers that more cases will follow, that the work now is to use this precedent wisely and persistently. He reminds everyone that the law, while powerful, is only as strong as the people who stand behind it. With the ruling in hand, organizations can push for changes in hiring practices, housing policies, and school zoning without having to prove the impossible, that someone wrote down their bigotry in plain words. Now they can show it in outcomes, in statistics, and patterns that no longer can be shrugged off. After the press conference, he speaks with a group of young activists who have gathered at the edge of the crowd. They are bright, earnest, and impatient for deeper transformation. He encourages them, saying that their energy and new ideas are exactly what's needed to ensure that this ruling becomes more than ink on paper. They ask him how to stay hopeful, how to keep going when setbacks come. He tells them what he's learned, that hope is not a feeling one waits for, but a discipline one practices. That you keep pushing because you know others pushed before you, and if they hadn't, you wouldn't have come this far. A week later, back in his office, he feels a shift in the air. Calls come in from colleagues in distant states, eager to file new suits under the clarified legal standard. Community leaders ask him to help them prepare workshops to educate people about their rights. Law students send emails thanking him for showing that a lawyer's voice can echo in the nation's highest halls if fueled by purpose and courage. He answers each inquiry patiently, remembering that he once reached out like this, hungry for guidance. Now it is his turn to mentor, to inspire, to help guide young minds along the paths he once found so challenging. As dusk settles, he stands by his window again, watching the lights flicker on in the buildings around him. He thinks of the countless names he will never know who will benefit from this ruling. He thinks of the children who, years from now, might attend better schools, secure better jobs, and step into a fairer world because the law learned to see what was once hidden. He's humbled by the understanding that his voice, combined with so many others, created a chord strong enough to reach the ears of the justices, and that their response, however cautious, represents progress. He will continue to represent clients who face discrimination. He will continue to refine arguments that chip away at old prejudices. He will continue to stand beside those who demand respect. But now he does so with the knowledge that the highest court of the land has begun to acknowledge the complexity of modern inequality. That alone cannot right all the wrongs, but it has changed the landscape. It has turned what was once an uphill battle into a climb supported by new footholds. In that quiet moment, Marcus knows that each chapter of this story is part of an unending narrative. The struggle for justice preceded him and will outlive him. Yet he is grateful he could play a role, that he could bend the arc a little. And when he steps away from the window and returns to his desk, he does so with a steady heart, ready to keep fighting for the world he knows can exist, even in the face of centuries-old resistance. As the years unfold, Marcus stands as a testament to what unwavering determination and a steadfast commitment to justice can achieve. From the segregated streets of his childhood to the hallowed halls of the Supreme Court, his journey has been one of resilience, growth, and profound impact. The landmark cases he has fought not only reshaped legal precedents, but also transformed lives and communities, leaving an indelible mark on the fabric of society. Reflecting on his path, Marcus remembers the early days filled with uncertainty and fear. The boy who once watched injustices unfold from the shadows had grown into a man who confronted them head-on. Each case he took on was more than a legal battle. It was a mission to honor the sacrifices of those who came before him and to pave the way for future generations. His work has empowered countless individuals to assert their rights, to demand fairness, and to believe in the possibility of a just world. Marcus's influence extends beyond the courtroom. He has become a mentor to young lawyers and activists, sharing his knowledge and inspiring them to continue the fight for equality. His speeches at universities and community centers resonate with passion and hope, igniting a spark in those who hear them. He speaks not only as a lawyer, but as a beacon of what one person can achieve when driven by purpose and compassion. His dedication has also led to meaningful legislative changes. By collaborating with policymakers and advocating for stronger anti-discrimination laws, Marcus has helped create a more equitable legal framework. These efforts have dismantled some of the systemic barriers that once seemed insurmountable, proving that change is possible when individuals unite for a common cause. Yet, Marcus remains humble, always remembering the roots from which he sprang. He frequents the community centers and neighborhoods that shaped him, offering pro bono services and supporting grassroots movements. He listens to the stories of those still battling discrimination, understanding that the fight is far from over. Each interaction reinforces his belief that the law is a living tool, capable of both oppression and liberation, depending on who wields it. His legacy is not just in the cases he wins or the laws he helps shape, but in the lives he touches and the hope he instills. Marcus embodies the power of education and resilience, demonstrating that one person's efforts can ripple outward, inspiring others to strive for a better world. His journey underscores the importance of standing up against injustice, of using one's talents and resources to uplift others, and of never underestimating the impact of steadfast dedication. In the quiet moments of his office, surrounded by the papers and books that have been his constant companions, Marcus reflects on the journey that has brought him here. He acknowledges the hardships, the setbacks, and the moments of doubt, but he also celebrates the victories, the connections, and the progress made. He knows that his work will continue, that new challenges will arise, and that the struggle for justice is an ongoing pursuit. But he is ready, fortified by the knowledge that he has already made a difference and that his efforts will continue to inspire and effect change. As he gazes out of his office window, watching the city thrive and evolve, Marcus feels a deep sense of fulfillment. He has fulfilled his dream of becoming a lawyer, not just in title but in essence, using the law as a force for good, advocating for those who cannot advocate for themselves, and ensuring that the promise of equality is more than just an ideal. His story is a beacon for others, a reminder that with resilience, education, and an unwavering pursuit of justice, one person truly can make a world of difference. Thank you for joining Marcus on his journey. Wherever you are, wherever you stand, remember that your voice matters, your actions count, and your dreams have the power to shape the world. Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from and your name. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next inspiring story. Together, we can continue to weave a tapestry of hope, resilience, and justice that uplifts us all.